Once, a lady came to my office to speak to me about the sadness she was experiencing for many years. She had had 5 miscarriages and was mourning the loss of her children. Her biggest difficulty with the issue, she explained, was that her children were condemned to hell because they were never baptized. I asked her how she had come to such a conclusion, and she answered that she was taught early in her life that all people who die and have never been baptized go to hell, even infants, because of original sin. The 2 questions I would like to raise here today are 1. Where has this idea come from? And 2. Is this the teaching of the Orthodox Church? Historically speaking, this idea was propagated through the centuries by the Roman Catholic Church. They received this teaching from the great saint and doctor of the Western Church, St. Augustine, who had based his anthropology on the concept of traducianism. According to the philosophical concept known as traducianism, human souls, like human bodies, are derived from the seed of the Father. Hence, the Father may transmit to his children even his own sins. This idea is clearly found in Tertullian and also in Ambrosiaster's commentary on Romans, which appeared during the papacy of Damasus, 366 to 384 AD. Augustine was influenced in his understanding of human nature by both Tertullian and Ambrosiaster. It was Ambrosiaster's commentary, however, that played a decisive role in Augustine's theory of original sin. It was here that Augustine found not only the traducianist concept, but also the idea of sinning in massa. In other words, that the whole human race has sinned through Adam and is condemned through his sin. Unfortunately, Augustine knew little Greek and seems to have failed to understand clearly the teachings of the Greek fathers who lived before him. Even though he had read some of the texts, which would have corrected his error on this issue, he failed to reach the same conclusions. Augustine believed that all human beings have sinned in Adam, in massa, and are thus condemned along with him. He believed that the fallen human condition and the original sin of Adam has defiled all humanity, and that this defilement is propagated through the act of procreation. He believed and taught that every human being born into the world inherits through the seed of his father the sin and guilt of Adam, the original sin, and is thus condemned to hell unless he or she is baptized. St. John Chrysostom, on the other hand, following the tradition of the Greek fathers before him, saw the transgression of Adam as the cause of our present fallen condition, i.e., the fallen human nature, where all are bound by weaknesses, shame, fear, suffering, and many natural shortcomings, but above all, that we are bound by death. Chrysostom believed that we have been condemned to this condition due to Adam's transgression, but not as a punishment, rather out of the mercy and the providence of God. Not only did we not lose from this, he claims, but in fact we have gained. This condition has become for us a training ground, a school for virtue, so that we can become capable of receiving the future gifts of God. Chrysostom rejects the idea that we are responsible for and being punished for Adam's sin as absurd. We are only responsible, he explains, and punished only for the sins that we commit ourselves willingly. With regard to baptism, Chrysostom agrees with infant baptism, not because there is a need to cleanse a child from the sin and guilt of Adam, or because infants have sins of their own, but because through baptism they will receive sanctification, justification, sonship, inheritance, brotherhood with Christ, become members of Christ, and a dwelling place for the Holy Spirit. He says nothing about the forgiveness of the sin of Adam, which a child may be bringing with it. In fact, nowhere in the texts which I have examined, including those quoted or referred to by St. Augustine in Contra Julianum Pelagianum, have I found any indication in the mind of Chrysostom of the existence of the notion of the propagation of the first sin through the act of procreation. From the examination of the text of Contra Julianum, it seems to me that Augustine had read these same texts, but either misunderstood or completely ignored the passages which explicated clearly the position of Chrysostom on the issue. The reason for this was probably because he was already convinced of the correctness of his own belief. It is also possible that in his own mind he thought he was protecting the memory of St. John Chrysostom from a possible association with the Pelagian heresy. There are some indications of this in his comments. In doing so, however, he established in the West a teaching of original sin not completely in line with the patristic tradition, at least of the East. This was to have a lasting effect on the Western Church, being accepted by Catholic and Protestant theologians alike until our times. There are obviously serious intellectual difficulties with Augustine's teaching. As Professor Gerald Bonner points out, it is not clear by what justice humanity can share in Adam's guilt, when it existed only in potentiality in his loins at the time of the fall. It is also difficult to see why the children of the baptized should inherit a guilt from which their parents have been cleansed. Finally, it has been argued that Pope Zosimos's condemnation of Pelagianism in his Trattoria did not constitute a complete endorsement of the canons of Carthage of 418 AD, which represent Augustine's doctrine in its most rigorous form. In other words, Bonner, a Roman Catholic theologian, questions this theology on three levels: the injustice inherent in this concept, the lack of consideration of the effects of baptism on the parents, and finally, the legality of such a doctrine on the basis of the non-endorsement of the canons of Carthage of 418 AD by Pope Zosimos. I would like to take this a step further and point to an important modern theological development in the West, which has its roots in Augustine's doctrine of original sin. This is the more recent doctrine-made dogma of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary. It seems to me that it was mainly the need of Roman Catholic theology to cleanse the Mother of God from Augustine's inherited guilt that led to the proclamation and final establishment of this new dogma. Had this notion of transmission of defilement and guilt from Adam to his descendants not been so strong in the West, there would have been no need for such a theological development. In conclusion, I offered the lady who had 5 miscarriages the theology of St. John Chrysostom as a more reasonable alternative to what she had known so far, and which was so troubling to her. I explained that God is just, and would never condemn anyone for someone else's sin. I argued that if human judges, who are sinful and imperfect, would never do such a thing, how could God, who is the supreme source of all justice? I pointed to St. Chrysostom's reassurance that children are innocent, and God receives them as such. In Homily 28 on Matthew, he quotes Sophia Sarah: "The souls of the just are in the hand of God," and concludes that so also are the souls of children, for they also are not wicked. The woman left with a smile on her face, she found peace and comfort in the reasonable teaching of the Orthodox Church.